Hello, and welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folktales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle, and today I am so excited. Today we are discussing divine androgyny, divine androgyny, non-binary, trans, non-gender conforming, history, deities, priests and priestesses, priesti. We're gonna get into the nitty-gritty because guess what, babe? Yes, you're correct. Non-binary has existed for thousands of years. Non-binary and transness are a part of human culture, point blank, period. We're going to get into the details. We're going to get into the history of different cultures, the perception, the role of people who do not conform to the gender binary. And we're going to get into some history about how things changes. Why am I talking like this? We're going to get into the history of how things changed and how we ended up here in the quote modern world, which I like to call the post medieval era, and why there is so much fear around people who live outside of the gender norm. Settle in, bitch. Get yourself a cup of tea, get yourself nice and cozy because we're going to go super deep. I'm so excited that you're here because guess what? Deep down to our core, all of us are actually just spirits from the quantum realm. Gender means nothing. Skin color means nothing. The cultures and truths that we associate with the physical world are illusions, Michael. And this is just your reminder. This is just your reminder that we live in a simulation. Relax. Relax. Stop stressing. Get over yourself. All of this is a construct, and ultimately, we're all just spirits floating around together. Duh. But I do think that the legacy of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, were all started with beautiful intentions, and sadly, throughout time, have been co opted for colonization. And through that, so much human culture has been erased. So much human culture has been erased for thousands of years because of the agendas of whoever decides that they're in charge. You know what I'm saying? And I think a great example of this is non-binary and trans individuals. They have always existed. Technically, all of us are non-binary and trans. I mean, that's my hot take. But really what I'm getting at is that like gender doesn't exist. Yes, we have genitals, but there are so many more intersex people than we realize. A lot of people don't even know that they're intersex because they're still have functioning genitalia as far as like being able to conceive, right? And so there is just so much social construct that we've built that is terrified of anything that doesn't fit within these gender binary roles, which are completely fabricated. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get into the details. Let's fucking talk about it. Let's start from the beginning, quote unquote, because, as we all know, historians have decided that Mesopotamia is the birth of civilization. And what, if you're new here, say it with me, Mesopotamia is most likely not the oldest civilization, but we don't have a lot of other civilizations on record. So we all kind of have to agree loosely that Mesopotamia is the beginning of human civilization, which it's not. Bueno, pero in Mesopotamia, imagine this is like 6, 7, 8,000 years ago. We're in the ancient city of Uruk. And what do we have but an entire group of priests? These were known as the priests of Inanna or the priests of Ishtar, our queen. We have talked about Inanna and Ishtar before, but just as a review, Inanna and or Ishtar is the goddess of love, the goddess of war, the goddess of transformation. She's also associated with gender reversal. Shut up. Let that sink in. I do have an episode about Inanna's descent into the underworld, and she, in essence, goes into the underworld, takes off all of her personal items, and then reemerges, and she is literally reborn. She's resurrected. And this is a big reason why she was associated with gender reversal. This idea of basically dying and shedding your skin and being reborn in a new form. It really is all about releasing and letting go of all of the past definitions of yourself and all of the worldly opinions of yourself. And like, would gender binary not fall into that? Yes, it would. So she was associated with gender reversal and the idea of living between a binary. So her clergy were most often male-born individuals who took on feminine roles. Shut up. We're talking 8,000 years ago, bitch. These were known as the Gala priests. And later in what was known as the cult of Cybele, which was in Rome, they inherited the same tradition. So these were people assigned male at birth who became seen in society as feminine priests, some of the most holy people in the culture. Now, the way that they were chosen varied. Many of them were chosen through visions. Like people would have visions, maybe a family member or even a member of the community would have a vision about a child. And through this vision or dream, this child would be recruited and trained. Also, sometimes it was within the family lineage. Perhaps like your parent was in this clergy. And so you inherited, you were kind of raised within the association, if you will. And some individuals just had incredible devotion. And so they were self-initiated and would live within these ranks by their own volition. I literally love this. So the most like common rituals that the Gala priests would participate in were known as laments, which were sacred songs, and also ecstatic rites. So this often involved drumming, chanting, dancing, burning sacred herbs, making oils and anointments. And one of the big reasons why they were the priests for Inanna was this idea of blurring the lines between male and female. The magic of not living in either one and living in the middle. Literally so iconic. Fascinatingly, they were revered in their culture, but also feared. There was this idea that they contained a channel to the divine power. And because they lived between worlds, they were seen as intimidating, but ultimately respected. I can relate. I mean, come on. How hot is this? This is so hot. Are you kidding me? I just love this. And obviously, spoiler alert, almost every single ancient culture has some legacy of this concept of being non-binary. And every single ancient culture has nothing but the highest respect for this concept and these individuals. And why is that? Because they transcend black and white. They transcend binary reality. Is that not power? Like, it's not fucking rocket science, people. This is kind of what pisses me off. Like, all of this energy that is wasted in the world on homophobia and transphobia and just phobia of anything that doesn't fall into monogamous heterosexuality. It's such a waste of time. Non-binary people are literally the most aligned. If you live in the middle, you're aligned with both pieces of yourself. Every single person contains feminine and masculine energy because really what it is hormones. Really what it is actually the opposing energies of nature. They're two sides of the same coin. And when you can embody both of them, you become your truest self. This is the idea of the lovers in the tarot. This is the idea of the Gemini. This is the idea of the Holy Hermaphrodite. Okay, we're going to get to the Holy Hermaphrodite. I'm really fired up right now. Let's keep it going. So now we will talk about the priests of Cybele. Now, technically, I'm skipping a little bit ahead chronologically, but I do want to mention them because the priests of Cybele are really a modernized clerical group that is really truly inspired by the Gala priests, the priests of Inanna. So that's kind of why I'm skipping ahead, okay? Get me? So the priests of Cybele were known as the Galli. Galli, Gala. See, it's the fucking same, but different. Also, according to most historians, and I believe this to be true as well, Aphrodite is basically Aphrodite slash Venus is really like Inanna 2.0. It's the Inanna of the Grecian Roman world. Okay, so the priests of Cybele, aka the Galli, were the non-binary priests of the Roman Empire. They were dedicated to Cybele, the great mother, the goddess mother. They would live as women or non-binary individuals, but they would dress in feminine garments. Okay? Female presenting, whatever, female presenting, quote unquote. And sometimes these individuals were assigned female at birth or identified as non-binary, dressing as in feminine garments. Great. In many Roman texts, they were described as, quote, androgynous and exotic. Um, I mean, ultimately, I think like the word exotic has been ruined by like white people, but in this context, like I think I see where they're coming from. Like I think they're saying like it's hot. It's like they're special, you know? That's what I'm hoping they're meaning. It is, I mean, knowing how much they were fucking in Rome, they had to be turned on by these people. How could you not? Non-binary, the hottest people ever. So, to become a priest of Cybele, initiation often came through an aesthetic festival where devotees were castrated in honor of Cybele's consort Attis, who was emasculated in the myth. That's pretty crazy. That's pretty crazy. Now, um, obviously, when we say castrated, I'm assuming we're talking about testicular removal. I can't imagine people lobbing their peppers off, but technically, we don't know the details. And I have found that like sometimes there's not a differentiation. Maybe that's just me. That's where my mind goes. But this is pretty extreme. We're talking about full castration and to connect and become a part of the clergy. That's pretty wild. It is said that they would dance in a frenzy, they would drum, and they would enter trance states. Their bodies were marked by self castration. They became living symbols of devotion and liminality. This is fucking hot. I'm sorry. I just think this is so cool. Romans respected the power of these priests, but they were also feared. Yep. The state restricted Roman citizens from becoming Galli, but foreigners would fill the role and they were kept in the priesthood. Fascinating. And again, this is kind of setting the stage. We're going to get there in a little bit, but I want that to sink in for you. Foreigners were allowed to join, but as time went on, the Roman Empire would not allow Roman citizens to become these priests. And ultimately, in my opinion, this is just sounding like classic misogyny. It's sounding like fearing these kinds of non-binary existences. I also think this is just like where my mind goes, but I do think that it's very possible that there is some colorism woven into this. For example, in the ancient Arab world, there was a lot of slavery. And actually, I am going to touch on this in a little bit, but um, in the Arab world, if you became a slave as a man, they would castrate you, um, so that you were not a danger to society. And what I mean by danger is like you wouldn't be able to have children with, blah, blah, blah. And then also they didn't see you as a human. And so by being castrated, you were not a quote real man. And so in some parts of the Arab world, like a eunuch was still allowed to see a woman without a hijab or without her face covered because they weren't seen as a real man. Now, um, I'm bringing this up because in Rome there was a lot of colorism. I mean, obviously there still is. And so perhaps there was a stigma around castration because they associated it with blackness. Because, spoiler alert, a lot of the people who were enslaved in the Arab world, in the ancient world, were Africans, and those were often the ones who were castrated. Perhaps there's a link here between castration and colorism. That's just me riffing though, and I do not have confirmation on that. So take what you will. I'm just a guy reporting, okay? Okay, so now I do really want to talk about the Holy Hermaphrodite. This is a concept that is very common in Greek mythology and in Greek philosophy, and eventually was also adopted into alchemy and is very likely a part of the Gemini concept. So, in Greek mythology, there's a character known as Hermaphroditus. And you guessed it, this is where the word hermaphrodite comes from. So, Hermaphroditus was the child of Hermes and the goddess Aphrodite. Aphrodite and Hermes have a baby, Hermaphroditus. And it was said that Hermaphroditus was merged with the water nymph Salmacis, and their bodies merged together and became one body, both male and female, an androgynous individual. Actually, this is reminding me of the movie Together. Have you guys seen that? It's a wild ride. I actually would recommend. I thought it was fun. So now Hermaphroditus has merged with this water nymph, and now they exist as a single body, both male and female. And it is a symbol of the unity of masculine and femininity. The idea of living in the liminal space, of boundary crossing, of fluidity, of true wholeness. And this represented beauty, desire, disruption of gender norms, and really the idea of being whole. Of course, later in philosophy, it became, I believe it was Plato. I could be wrong, but there was a belief, an idea in Greek philosophy that in the ancient times, all of us were essentially hermaphrodites. We were like in technically two individuals combined together, and then the gods separated us. And so this idea of soulmates is finding this other half of yourself that in a past life you were once one. And this idea, this concept is derivative of this Hermaphroditus story. So in alchemy and mysticism, this concept kind of like gets a little bit deeper. It's known as the rebis, or which translates to the double thing, or also the divine hermaphrodite. And this is a figure that is often crowned, holding a sun and a moon, and sometimes standing on a dragon. And this is a symbol that was often used in alchemical texts and alchemical writings and even just philosophical writings. The idea of this symbol was the idea of the union of opposites. So the allegory is male and female, but really it's like sun and moon, spirit and matter, positive, negative. The idea of like combining divine opposites to create like an eternal charge. And ultimately the goal of alchemy is achieving wholeness and balance. It's about achieving eternal life. It's about merging yourself with God. So this idea of the holy hermaphrodite became like a huge commonly used symbol within alchemy and the ideas of elevating and enlightening yourself. Let's take a quick break. Esoterica and Nonsense wants to hear from you. We have listener episodes coming, and I want to tell your story. Maybe you've had a really freaky dream. Maybe you had some crazy religious experience. Maybe you grew up in a cult. Maybe you actually just have some random stories that your grandma used to tell you growing up. Maybe you just want to share something random with me. The floodgates are open. Please email in your story at esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com. Any story that comes to your mind, I want to hear it, even if you just want to say hi. We love that. We are all for it. And get ready for some listener episodes coming soon. Every time I think of alchemy, I think about Faust and this idea of this longing to feel fulfilled and whole and feeling so lost. Um, and actually, I've been meaning to do an episode on Faust, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay on track. So, next up, we have a very, very fascinating individual. And this is the deity Ardhanarishvara, who is a god of the Hindu pantheon. And in Sanskrit, the name Ardhanarishvara is broken down into Ardha, which means half, and Nari, which means woman, and Ishvara, which means Lord. So it is like the half woman Lord. I mean, already I'm captivated. I'm on board. Yes. So this deity was a composite form of Shiva, who is the god of destruction, death, and rebirth, and Parvati slash Shakti, who is the goddess of femininity, of love, etc. Okay, so this being, interestingly, is not the child of Shiva and Parvati. It is the combination of Shiva and Parvati. Ooh, sorry, I just scratched my mic. Apologies. So, this entity, Ardhanarishvara, is often depicted as a deity split down the middle, half male and half female. Again, this is giving Holy Hermaphrodite. This was really a representation of a union of opposites, the inseparability of masculine and feminine, of cosmic dualities. The non-binary divinity embodies that divinity itself transcends human categories of gender and transcends the idea of living within a binary system. The whole point of being able to be an ascended being is being everything everywhere all at once. Don't you see? I also find it interesting. I mean, to be a human is bizarre because you do experience what it's like to be an individual. But I think we forget that our genitals exist as a pair. Obviously, there's a spectrum of somewhere in between, but my point is, like, humans don't, they couldn't exist as just women or just men, right? It's the pair that fits together that creates new life. And so I guess what I'm getting at is, like, there are plants that are masculine and feminine. Like, certain trees are masculine trees. They do not bear fruit, only pollen. And other trees are female fruits. They will create fruits that can be fertilized by pollen. But also a lot of plants are hermaphroditic, and we often don't gender plants. I mean, technically science and botanists will, but a regular person will just say, oh, this is like a sycamore tree, this is an oak tree, this is a mango tree. Like, we aren't realizing that, like, gender, the idea of gender is really just about fertilization and an egg growing. And I think it's become an obsession of us um just obsessing over genitalia and forgetting the truth, which is all of us are just spirits living within physical forms, and it's really not that serious. I just, yeah. Am I just repeating myself again and again? I'm just hyped. I'm hyped, you guys. So, um, interestingly and non-surprisingly, within the culture of India, there is also non-binary people and trans people. Hello. These people are known as the Hijra. And the Hijra are a community of people that have existed for thousands of years. They are not considered fully men nor women, and they occupy a sacred third gender in both Hindu and Muslim traditions. They were often called through a mix of lineage, initiation, and personal revelation. Some will join these communities after feeling an affinity towards them from childhood. Nowadays, um, it's interesting. I think it depends on the region you're in, but often nowadays these individuals are chosen from birth and are often from lower castes in the caste system. So they have a very interesting role in society. They bless newborns as well as weddings. They will sing, dance, and do clapping rituals, and this is believed to invoke fertility and ward off evil. They also hold sacred initiation rites, invoking what is known as the Bahuchara Mata, a goddess linked with gender variance. Sadly, through the colonization of India by the British, these individuals became seen as outcasts and condemned. So in the ancient world, these individuals had a lot of respect and were considered to be spiritual leaders and magical individuals. And then after the colonization of the British, they were seen as like unsavory, unrespected individuals. And so fascinatingly, um, during my time in India, when I was in big cities, I would see Hijra, and they, some of my friends were telling me that in a lot of parts of India, they're actually considered bad luck. And so, for example, if you were on the train and one of them came into your train car, people would often give them money. The idea being they would leave faster. And if they leave faster, you wouldn't get bad luck. However, when you have a newborn baby, you have to invite one because it's bad luck for them not to be there. And if you have a wedding, you're supposed to invite one because it's bad luck for them not to be there. And I found it to be so heartbreaking. I found it to be so heartbreaking because the legacy of colonization is about ostracizing, oppressing, and excommunicating people for arbitrary reasons. And I just found it was so fascinating that, of course, like there was so much dogma and superstition from their ancient roots, right? They felt like they had to have these individuals at their baby shower or at their wedding. But then they also were indoctrinated by these newer colonial values that these individuals are bad luck or they're unsavory or they're, whatever. And I think that's why I've always been fascinated with the ancient world because one, I've just always been like a little witchy, freaky kid. But beyond that, I've always wondered why we do certain things. There seems to be so much blind faith or like blind dogmatic rituals that I always found it bizarre that so many people never questioned, you know? I find it so bizarre how little people question social norms and just allow them to be normal. But like right, like where do they come from? Why are we this way? Why do we have these beauty norms or gender norms or like whatever? Like all human culture is borrowing from the culture of yesterday, and that goes back for thousands of years. And I think it's fascinating how easy it is for culture to just absorb the trauma of yesterday. And I guess my like rhetorical question is how much of our human society is just at war with itself because we have ancient practices that then have been condemned through colonization. So we have all of these opposing cultural beliefs and rituals, which are a mixture of the more modern condemning rituals as well as these ancient rituals, you know? The idea being transness and non-binary individuals have existed forever. And in a weird way, these individuals are captivating and beautiful and seen as these like mysterious, powerful artists and makers of magic, and yet they're feared and condemned and like, blah blah blah. Anyway, I think this topic, specifically gender, really highlights colonization at work and how colonization has really sunken into the minds of so many, even people who don't consider themselves dogmatic or superstitious or religious. These concepts of colonization have become a social ritual and therefore have been considered normal. Sometimes it just makes me want to vomit. Also, honorable mention, I do want to bring up Inari Okami, who I did talk about on my Gods of Grain episode. But Inari Okami is a Japanese deity associated with rice, and associated with the spirit world and with foxes. And Inari Okami is considered to be non-binary. Inari Okami is either depicted as a beautiful woman or as like an old man or as like a androgynous baddie. Hot. Also, another honorable mention is the goddess Guan Yin. I do have an episode on Guan Yin I highly recommend. And Guan Yin is also another deity who in some traditions is depicted as a man, and in some depictions is portrayed as a woman, and in some traditions portrayed as an androgynous enlightened being. So you heard it here first, baby. Maybe you didn't hear it here first. Okay, so next up we have the Māhū. The Māhū are people from Hawaii and Tahiti. And Māhū loosely translates to in the middle. These are individuals that embody both male and female qualities. They are considered teachers of dancing, of healing, and guardians of culture. Many Māhū were recognized in childhood for their special gifts, and families would often encourage them to pursue spiritual and artistic paths. They would teach sacred chants, they would lead ceremonies, and act as intermediaries in community healing. In Tahiti, Māhū also cared for sacred spaces and maintained oral histories. Colonizers eventually condemned them, but traditionally they were honored as balance keepers. Today, in many parts of the islands of the Pacific, individuals who are Māhū are reclaiming their identity and reclaiming their cultural pride. Ugh. It literally just makes me like my heart just breaks. My heart just breaks. And again, like there are so many of these individuals across the world. I'm not even covering all of them. I'm covering some of these non-binary and slash trans slash non-conforming communities. And my heart just breaks by cultures and communities that perhaps we did erase. Perhaps we burned books and killed people who carried the oral tradition and the cultural traditions of their society. And I just my heart breaks with how much erasure, how much violence, and how much suppression has been done under the name of conquest and colonization. And it's fucking gross. So next up, we have what is known as the Babaylan. This is a group of people from the Philippines. And obviously, before Spanish colonization, the Babaylan were considered to be sorcerers. They were often women, but they were also often male born people who dressed and lived as women. Um, so these They would dress and live as women, but they kind of existed outside of just being a regular woman because they were considered sorcerers and magicians. So it basically didn't really matter what their genitals were, it didn't really matter any of that. They were seen as doers of magic. I also just like want to mention, I just find it fascinating that almost all of these groups, regardless if they are assigned male or female at birth, when they take on this role of being a doer of magic, are dressing and acting as women in whatever that means in their culture. And I think that's very poignant. It does remind me in one of my Alien episodes, I think it's Introduction to Aliens Part 2, there is a blurb from some aliens who are talking about like, pay attention, all of the priests, all of the men on your planet who are claiming to be spiritual hierarchy are all wearing dresses and trying to co-opt female culture because female is God. Get with it, baby. So, in the Philippines, in the ancient world, a lot of these individuals, the Babaylan, were chosen through visions. Um, and oftentimes they would apprentice under older Babaylan. They would participate in healing ceremonies. They would help with exorcisms, divination, and agricultural blessings. They would lead the community rituals to ensure good harvests and to appease the ancestral spirits. They were seen as powerful. They were often feared, but they were central to community survival. And then, of course, through the Spanish conquest of the Philippines, the Spanish labeled them as witches and persecuted and murdered many of them. I'm literally laughing to keep from crying. I just can't. Like, God damn it. Uh, of course, now we must mention the two spirit individuals of North America. I really do love this term, and in my opinion, it's kind of like my favorite way to describe non-binary, two spirit. And all over North America, many nations of indigenous communities recognized the gender expansive people as having unique spiritual power. Yes, thank you. Their roles would vary. They were often medicine people, matchmakers, visionaries. Some were recognized in childhood for showing traits of both genders, and families and elders would often affirm their roles and encourage these individuals to start apprenticeships with the magical elders of their community. They would lead rituals of healing, of vision quests, dream interpretations, meditation in mediation in conflicts. They embodied balance and were often central to ceremonies of said group. And then, of course, European colonizers violently suppressed them, murdered a lot of them, and used Christianity to create shame and condemnation. Luckily, though, today, so many groups are starting to reclaim their heritage and to identify as two spirit and continue the sacred tradition. Ugh. Literally, like, I could fucking vomit. This episode's such a roller coaster because as I'm like reading about these individuals, like my heart is swelling. I'm like, oh, I love this. And then it just all ends with them being like murdered and persecuted by white guys. Like, ugh. Just makes me want to projectile vom. Let's take a quick break. Hi, it's me, Annabelle. And if you've made it this far, I appreciate you so much. Please like and subscribe my channel, my page. I have so many kinds of content and I'm working on new kinds. You may be listening to me just through my podcast or through YouTube. You should check out my YouTube if you're not watching or listening to me there. I have meditation videos. I have yoga videos coming soon. I have my full length podcast. I'm doing short episodes. I'm doing shorts. And soon I'm going to be having listener episodes. So, like, subscribe. Thanks, babe. Love you. Okay, baby. Next up, we have the deities, priests, and the gender fluid individuals of West Africa. So, within West Africa, there was a melange of deities, beliefs, and now, of course, there's kind of an umbrella term that we use um, known as the Yoruba tradition, which, similar to Hinduism, is kind of an umbrella term and has kind of branched into subdivisions depending on region. And then, of course, in the Caribbean and parts of South America, they have taken on new life after the transatlantic slave trade and emigration of so many Africans into the West. Most non-consensually, some consensually. So the Yoruba tradition of West Africa, um, in South America and the Caribbean, is sometimes known as Santeria, but essentially there is a deity or orisha known as Isu or Elegba, and this individual is known to shift genders, embodying duality, and the priests of Esu would serve them and often themselves present as non-binary and exist between gender lines. Through divination, dreams, and hereditary priestly lineages, this legacy would be passed on. These individuals would dance, they would have possession ceremonies, offerings, and would often take on what was known as spirit possessions. And while being possessed by a spirit, they could transform their gender identity, and this was considered a divine expression. However, Isu is not the only non binary angel. Interestingly, a lot of the Yoruba individuals are not really considered a single gender. They are depicted as being male or female, but ultimately they transcend humanity and therefore are not really considered to be part of the binary. One super amazing individual that I love, and actually, I should say, I mean, this is true for all of them, but specifically within Santeria and the Yoruba tradition, a lot of their culture and religion is practiced through the oral tradition. So that's why a lot of my information does feel kind of brief. I do really want to be able to touch on as many as I can, and I also just want to make space for the fact that the richest history we can get is through oral tradition. And that is why colonization is so devastating, because when you kill huge amounts of people, you lose parts of their ancient culture. So, anyway, just wanted to bring that up. However, this Orisha, this deity, is known as Obatalá, who is a non binary serpentine haughty. Obatalá is an Orisha who transcends gender truly. And they are often described as father and mother of humanity at the same time. They have both cool masculine authority and cool feminine qualities. Essentially, the masculine authority is wisdom and judgment, and the quote feminine qualities are the idea of nurturing, gentleness, and protection. But Obatalá is both. Obatalá is neither male nor female. However, Obatalá is often depicted as a male. However, they do exist beyond gender, embodying balance. Obatalá also, fascinatingly, is linked with the cosmic serpent of life. They are often depicted with a serpent or snake tail, representing wisdom, rebirth, and the cyclical flow of life. Also, um, another honorable mention is that in a lot of South American traditions, they see the creator of life as a primordial serpent. And so this idea of Obatala having a serpent tail and a human body could also really kind of be indicative of like the creator of all things. It's like kind of like merman vibes. And Obatalá is associated with rainbows. Like, are you kidding me? Shut up. And again, I just do want to be really clear that within Yoruba and Santeria, it is an oral tradition. And so I'm giving like general beats, but depending on who you talk to, depending on what region of the world they grew up in, there are varying degrees and beliefs around each orisha. Okay? So I just need to be clear. So now I do really want to take a moment and touch on eunuchs. I did talk about them earlier, but within the Arabic Caliphate and also within the Byzantine and Ottoman empires, eunuchs who are castrated men were considered a distinct gender. Now, again, I personally, this is like a personal hot take. I personally think that this is a part of the stigma and fear around non-binary and trans individuals, especially because, not as a surprise, most of the most actively homophobic people are heterosexual cis men. And I do think that there is an aspect of this that comes from the ancient world and a fear of being castrated. Okay, let's get into it. So, within the Byzantine, Ottoman, and Arabic Caliphate, eunuchs held a unique social and spiritual power. They were trusted in harems and often became high officials. Some scholars argue that they were seen as a third category or third gender, not quite male and not female. Interestingly, as well, within the Arab Caliphate, often they were enslaving Africans and castrating them. Interestingly, though, eunuchs were given more respect. They were allowed to be around women without their faces covered, and they were often allowed to buy their freedom and sometimes would become very high ranking men in the military or high ranking men in the court of the caliph or emperor. Also, in China, there were imperial eunuchs and they would manage sacred and political rituals. However, they were stigmatized socially, but they were also seen as powerful people as they lived in the liminal space between genders. In many ancient traditions, the lack of reproductive organs was seen not as a deficiency, but as a transcendence of earthly binaries, a state closer to divine service. Another interesting thing, too, is that in some traditions, especially within the clergy, even in some parts of Europe in the old world, they would sometimes castrate young boys thinking that it would make them less lustful and less earthly, therefore more spiritual. I find this to be fascinating. I also, like I said, I do think perhaps specifically in the Arab world, the idea of being castrated and seen as this third gender and having it be associated with enslavement is crucial. Um, and I do think that has tainted the quote, like heterosexual colonial culture. That's just my opinion. So ultimately, there is no question that non binary as a concept has existed for thousands of years. Thousands. But I do really want to talk about why that seems to be contested. Why is it in our current day that the idea of non-binary is considered new and like it's considered a lie and it's considered silly by so many? And like what happened? What happened for seemingly the entire ancient world to hold space for the idea of being non-binary, being trans, living outside of binary gender norms? What happened for that to be erased and seemingly forgotten? And you guessed it. A big reason why non-binary culture was erased and stigmatized was through the Roman Empire and the sanctification of Christianity and using it as a tool of colonization. There is an episode I have about the Coptic people. I think it's episode 2. And I really do think it's worth a listen. It really kind of helps you understand how Christianity was created and then what it turned into once the Roman Empire recognized that it was the easiest way to control people's beliefs. And I'm bringing this up because truly there is no evidence within the original texts and culture of Christianity that it was homophobic at all. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But some of the newer translations are most likely mistranslations to condemn homosexuality when originally there was never such condemnations. So let's take a moment. Let's step back into the ancient world. In ancient Greece and ancient Rome, many men were having sex with each other. And of course, all around the world, men were having sex with each other. Specifically in Greece and Rome, it was very common for men to have sex with other men in more of like a friendship mentor capacity. It was very common for older men to start mentoring a younger man, and then part of that was sexual relations. So it was very normal in these cultures for men to be having sex with other men while still having wives, and their primary partner being a woman. They would be a family man, and then they would also have sex with men. Now, of course, as we touched on, the idea of gender binary wasn't also so rigid. In almost every culture, there was people who lived in the liminal space between genders. There was people who were also just living openly and proudly as gay. And interestingly enough, gay marriage was legal in ancient Rome. And most likely, the reason why the Romans condemned homosexuality and condemned this idea of non-binary is because in every ancient culture, non-binary people were seen as magical and they were seen as priests. And the whole point of Rome co-opting Christianity was to control people. They wanted to appoint religious leaders because they recognized that people listened more to religious leaders than they listened to political leaders. And they did not want to be competing over who was the religious leader. And that is why they started so many inquisitions, so many crusades against anyone who wasn't Christian. They wanted everyone to either convert or die because they needed to control people. These are facts. I'm not even sensationalizing this. Okay, so in around the year 13, my bad, sorry, around the year 313, Common Era, Christianity officially becomes the legal religion of the Roman Empire. And within like 30 years, in the year 342, the first Roman law is passed, which criminalizes male and male sex. So, literally, before this, male and male sex was totally normal and totally legal. Now it's illegal in the year 342. Fast forward into the 390s, Emperor Theodosius makes Christianity the state religion. Oh, sorry. Fuck, I fucked this up. 313, Christianity becomes legal. And in the 390s, Christianity becomes the religion of Rome. Also, when that happens, they make, quote, sodomy a sinful and heretical act. And again, in Rome, a lot of men were having sex with their mentors. And perhaps that's another angle of why they made it illegal. This idea that they didn't want men to be colluding with other men. They don't want younger men to be listening to the philosophies and ideas of their mentor. They want them to only respond to the Pope, the secret emperor, I like to call him, of the world. And then, of course, fast forward into the Middle Ages, the church doctrines frame sexuality as, quote, against nature. However, the question is, where are they getting this information? You know what I mean? Like, why are they thinking that homosexuality is so terrible? Well, Let's talk about it. Um, a lot of historians who have looked at the Bible, specifically the newer translation. So, of course, the oldest Bible, uh, the oldest copies of the Bible that they have found are written in Coptic Egyptian, the ancient Ethiopian language, Aramaic, and ancient Greek. Eventually, obviously, it was translated into Latin, and then hundreds of years later, it was translated to English and all kinds of languages. However, most historians can agree that the translations of many newer Bibles are probably fairly wrong. And it's kind of nuanced because some of these languages are dead. And also, we're missing cultural context. I feel like I talk about this every episode, but without cultural context of a certain culture, even if you translated something verbatim, you still may miss nuance about a certain symbol or idea. An example being an apple. An apple's talked about in Genesis. What if in a certain culture, apples are associated with twins, or they're associated with sex, or they're associated with death? So while you're reading a story about apples, it actually could be about eating the apple of death. And that's just like a cultural understanding. They bring apples to funerals, and every time you bury someone, you put an apple tree on top. You know what I'm like? My point is, without context, there could be so much that we don't understand about the story. Okay, so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because in Genesis, there is a quote about man, um, God, basically God destroying the city of Sodom because of homosexuality. But interestingly, in the Hebrew passage, instead of saying like sex, they use a word known as yada, which means to know. So it could be interpreted by saying to know someone is to have sex with them. However, some people believe that this was a euphemism for non-consensual sex, violent sex, non-consensual and violent sex. So the idea being not that sodomy is wrong, but the idea of forcing yourself on a person, graping a person is sinful. And interestingly, in Ezekiel 16:49, he defines Sodom's sin as pride, greed, and neglect of the poor. Nowhere in there is homosexuality mentioned. Also, in Leviticus, there is a passage about how man should not lie with a man, as it is an abomination. However, it is very possibly a misinterpretation that instead of it just being about sex, that it is very likely that it could be about non-consensual sex. By having non-consensual sex and overpowering someone, that is the abomination. Hmm. Hmm. So, I mean, again, we could like dissect the whole Bible. I'm not here to do that. I'm not here to go, to go super deep in the Bible. Maybe I should do an episode on the Bible. But ultimately, what I want us all to think about is how much of our minds, our opinions, our ideas, our ideals, our morals, how much of those things are actually based off of ancient dogmatic beliefs, and possibly based off dogmatic beliefs that were created to control people. How fascinating that for hundreds, for thousands of years, men and women were having sex with each other. People were non binary, people were trans, people were having gay sex. And within a few hundred years, it became condemned and illegal, and people were murdering and killing each other over it. So I guess what I want you to think about is like, how much of your opinions are actually yours, and how many of them have just been shaped by dudes thousands of years ago who have created new cultural norms that we're perpetuating. Gay people, non-binary people, trans people have always existed, and it's really just not a big deal because at our core, none of us are binary. Put that in your pipe and smoke it.